Hello, I'm Katty Kay in Washington.
And I'm Carlos Watson in California.
And welcome to When Katty Met Carlos,
a new podcast that looks at some of the ways that the U.S. is reshaping its future, brought to you by the BBC World Service and OZY Media. So, Katty, Happy New Year. Man, this new year is bringing us some big changes. Needless to say, in a few weeks, President-elect Biden will be the new occupant of the White House, and perhaps even more people will have access to the COVID-19 vaccine.
Yeah, I think 2020 was one of those years that got no stars in the review charts. I think you have said that before. And in terms of news and change, it has been busier than any year I can think of. We've had the pandemic, we've had the US presidential election that went on and on and on forever, it seemed like. And of course, we've had the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement this past summer. So this week, in the first program of the new year, we want to look back a little and forward a bit at that movement, at Black Lives Matter, at what has been called the largest social movement of the 21st century.
Indeed. Of course, in 2020, after the brutal killings of George Floyd and so many other Black Americans by police officers, we saw a huge Black Lives Matter demonstration and growth of the movement, not just in the U.S., but all around the world. Politicians, athletes, actors, musicians, even big corporations joined in denouncing systemic racism.
So where does the Black Lives Matter movement and its decentralized, often disparate members and activists go from here?
Our guest today is Opal Tometi, one of the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement. Opal, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
Opal, how did you become involved in the Black Lives Matter movement and help to co-found what we think of today?
Well, I've been an organizer for many, many years now, to be quite honest. And, I'm Nigerian American, born and raised in Phoenix, Arizona, and really came of age in a context where I was oftentimes the only Black person in the room or Black person in my grade or, things like that. But to get really specific with Black Lives Matter, I was actually the executive director of the Black Alliance for Just Immigration, which is the United States' first immigrant rights organization for Black people. While I was doing this work, I was watching, sadly, the case of George Zimmerman unfold on national television. And for those folks who might not recall, George Zimmerman was the man who killed 17-year-old Trayvon Martin. And, anytime I say Trayvon's name, my heart just gets so heavy because he reminds me of the young people in my life, and he reminded me of my younger brothers. And of course, George Zimmerman was found essentially not guilty. He was acquitted. And it broke my heart. I was devastated. I bawled my eyes out and then went to social media, was looking for a little bit of solace, was looking to express myself, was looking to connect. And that was where I saw a Facebook post by Alicia Garza, who is one of the other co-founders of Black Lives Matter. And she had a lovely post online that really captured what I was feeling at the time. And it was kind of like a love note. And it ended in, Black people, I love us, our lives matter. And then Patrisse Cullors, who I didn't know actually at the time, but she put a hashtag on it. And this is on Facebook, mind you. And this is 7 years ago now. People didn't really use hashtags there, but she did. And I remember seeing the post, being very moved by it. And so I reached out to her and just said, hey, not sure what you're doing, but I would love for us to build this thing out. And, do you mind if I buy blacklivesmatter.com and launch our social media platforms and invite the other organizers we know to participate? And it just felt like this was a time for us to step up in our own leadership in a bigger way.
Did you have a sense then, Opal, an overarching concept of what you wanted the movement to be? And you were going to have a social media presence and you were going to see where it took you?
Yeah, at that time, to be quite honest, I felt it in my bones that this was it. Those three words, Black Lives Matter, was a demand. It was a deep affirmation for us. And it felt like it was the time. I felt it then, but I think we're just now beginning to see what that truly meant and what we were trying to capture at that time.
7 years on, Opal, what do you think the biggest achievement of Black Lives Matter is, and where do you hope we go from here?
Well, I've been really moved by the fact that there are millions of people who've been involved in this movement now. I'm proud of the fact that, yes, when we did start, it was largely Black people who were the ones who were out in the streets and the most, focused on the movement. And then, of course, we had our allies who were there from day one as well. But it's really grown over the years. And now we're seeing what I call a truly multiracial movement for Black lives. That's, to me, is the most important part of this.
Opal, the movement's been huge. Protests have been completely global. 60 different countries have seen anti-racism protests. I think every continent apart from Antarctica has had Black Lives Matter protests during the course of this year. When I look at the 21st century, the other two big movements that I think of, the big social movements, are Occupy Wall Street and the Me Too movement. How do you think of it in comparison to other social movements that we've seen recently?
Well, I don't think of it in comparison, but I think about it as complementary. I do know that so many of us who are part of Black Lives Matter were also part of Occupy, are also part of Me Too. And so, the questions and the challenges that were made clear by those social movements and are continuing to be made clear by those social movements are central to BLM as well. So issues around income disparities and, the way we distribute resources in the country is squarely part of the concerns of our movement.
Opal, talk about where, anytime you work hard on something, they're both things that you're proud of and opportunities ahead, but also probably places where you think you've fallen short. Where do you think Black Lives Matter has fallen short thus far?
I largely think of the BLM successes, right? I just largely think about that. But I think one of the things that most challenges our movement in ensuring that we're heard is just the terrible backlash that we're up against. And we see vigilantes that are out in the streets, vigilantes that are armed, who are committing acts of violence. We've seen police stand alongside them. And I just don't know that our society has done a good enough job of protecting activists and protesters.
Of course, there's also been a lot of criticism of the BLM movement and some of the protests for the violence that's been at some of those protests. Now, I know that 93%, according to one study, of the Black Lives Matter protests have been peaceful protests, but there's been an awful lot of focus, I'm sure you've seen it in the press, about the 7% that haven't. And some people would say that the protests themselves have become violent, that there's been looting associated with them. How do you respond to that criticism?
Yeah. And so to me, that's also, a concern in terms of how it plays out in the media. Only 7% may have had some sort of property damage. And I don't call it violence. I don't call it violence. There's violence against people, but in terms of, damage to property, I just value people's lives and what they're concerned about more than the property. And I think we just have to distinguish.
So you don't have any concerns about some of the attacks on property, on the looting, on people's shops that have been looted or windows broken, and that it doesn't bother you?
I think what Martin Luther King Jr. said about the riot, right, or the protests being the voice of the unheard, I think that is very true. When people go unheard year in, year out for generations, I think there's a natural reaction, and it might be expressed in a variety of ways. And in this case, it's so minimal that it doesn't warrant the type of discourse that it currently gets. But beyond that, what we do also know is that there were many people who were sent into these protests, who were sent to do damage, to discredit the movement, to make confusion, to incite violence, and so on. And so to me, it's really dangerous and erroneous to attribute those bad actors with the main goals of the movement and with the majority of what the movement has been about.
Opal, I actually would love to bring in a conservative commentator, the editor of a conservative journal called Modern Age, Daniel McCarthy. Would you take a listen to what he shared recently?
The Black Lives Matter movement became somewhat co-opted, I think, by a political spirit which was in fact, very much driven by animus against President Trump and by a general sort of a spirit of hostility towards America's institutions, as opposed to a focus purely on the question of the relationships between police and African Americans. And I think so, Black Lives Matter wound up becoming a somewhat runaway train. It's certainly true that there's this dilemma where, on the one hand, there is the risk of a protest movement becoming a kind of force unto itself and distracting from the issue that it's meant to be drawing attention to. Yet at the same time, you obviously do have to have some degree of spectacle or some degree of pressure in order to get attention to important issues in the first place. Nevertheless, with Black Lives Matter and with protests which became disorderly and led to disruption in America's cities over the summer of 2020, it's pretty clear that Black Lives Matter reached a point where it was no longer being effective as a protest movement and was becoming instead something that was rather more destructive to America's way of life. There are real issues with policing, which can be very heavy-handed at times, and there are real issues with the plight of Black Americans. And the question becomes whether Black Lives Matter is effectively addressing those concerns or is in fact making matters worse, because the other thing that has to be kept in mind is the impact of crime upon the lives of Black Americans. I worry that many white liberals and white people on the left have decided to focus on symbolism over substance. And as a result, they like to talk about Black Lives Matter, they like to use the slogans of Black Lives Matter, and they like to go out and protest. But they're not actually concerned with the plight of real Black lives, which has to do with what's going on in cities in terms of crime and in terms of lack of opportunity, much of which has nothing to do with the police. And in several instances, the police are in fact the solution rather than the problem. I suspect that in the future, the Black Lives Matter movement will continue to be of salience from time to time, especially when there are outrages that may be committed by police or that may appear to be committed by police. And so we will see flare-ups, but I don't think that this is something which is going to be a real driving force for policy reform in the long term in America's cities.
That's Daniel McCarthy, the editor of the conservative journal Modern Age. Opal, how do you hear that critique?
I honestly don't agree with this critique. I do believe that there are millions and millions of courageous people who are, of conscience, who believe in this movement and who are doing the work to make sure that the consciousness around BLM is not just symbolic, but that it is substantive. And I know this by the various initiatives that I've seen from both, the private sector and the public sectors. And I know this by the work that we do engaging real people and real leaders every single day.
Oh, quickly, just can I pick up on one thing? Is there a risk with any movement that to some extent people do jump on the bandwagon? And was it a summer of activism, or do you feel it's just as potent today as it was back in June, July, August?
I don't believe that you can sustain that level of energy in the streets for years on end or months on end. I don't think that's the core strategy. Social movements take on various characteristics, and we need various strategies in order to have the types of change. My encouragement for people who are newer to the movement is just to understand that while we need protest and visibility and all of that, we also need people who are willing to put in the work behind the scenes. And we need people who are willing to join organizations to build new institutions or to reform existing institutions in order to make this reality come to fruition. Laws and policies, they're not written in the streets. They're written behind closed doors. They're written in other types of rooms. And so I think we just have to be mindful of the fact that multiple things must exist in order for our society to achieve what we deserve.
Opal, to that point, do you see President-elect Biden as an ally?
I don't see President-elect Biden as an ally, but I see him as a person who is in power and has the ability to help change the United States and make it a place that is more fair and more just. I'm not going to be naive. He is the president of the United States. And just like President Barack Obama, we had to rally and protest. And Black Lives Matter was started under the Obama administration, not under Trump, as many people kind of forget. While I do believe that Joe Biden is somebody who cares about Black people. He is somebody that we're going to have to push to do the right thing. We can't be easy on him, just like we weren't easy on President Obama, just like we weren't easy on President Trump.
And Opal, be even more specific for me on some of the policy recommendations that you would like to see.
One of the most important policies that I think could come into being under the Biden administration would be the Breathe Act. It is our generation's Civil Rights Act. It does include measures that look at taking some of the disproportionate allocations for policing and reallocating them towards mental health services, towards education, towards job opportunities, and so on. And so I think one of the easiest things that the Biden administration can do is to sign the Breathe Act into law. We also know that our communities are reeling from the pandemic. And this is absolutely Black communities who are faring the worst and are dying in disproportionate numbers. Black businesses have really been hard hit. 41% of Black-owned businesses have gone under as a result of this pandemic. We're also calling for an end to these injustices around climate change. These are all issues of concern to communities of color because we are acutely hit by them. And so while many people might not think that these are the kinds of concerns one might articulate when being asked this type of question, these are the things that are top of mind. We need to prioritize those who are most marginalized.
Opal, those are clearly, when it comes to the US society in particular, racial injustice touches almost every aspect of life, not just police brutality, which is what people, I think, around the world saw when they saw the Black Lives Matter movement. But the movement has gone global. We saw protests inspired by your organization in London, Lagos, Sao Paulo, Mexico City, Sydney. I want to have a listen now to Marvina Newton. She's a founding member of the Black Lives Matter movement in the northern English city of Leeds.
I got involved with Black Lives Matter Leeds through an organisation I work with called Angel of Youth. One of the young girls was quite moved by Trayvon Martin's incident, and we looked across the pond and saw what BLM was doing and the fact that we were being invited that anyone could do something in their local area in solidarity. And we set up our own chapter in Leeds, and that gave us a voice and influence to be able to challenge the inequalities we faced. For me, it was just seeing that it was a group of Black liberation women. Like, it was definitely for all Black people, but they highlighted those that kept being left out of the conversation. And for me, that felt so empowering. After George Floyd died, there was this general trauma bond we all went through, where it just felt like enough is enough. But what was important was the solidarity that we started seeing, was the awakening of our allies and the power of unity, to see different people from different background, different class, gender, religion or faith, all coming together and just saying Black Lives Matter. It has a unique way of bringing all Black lives, voices together, irregardless of where they are. So it gives us that platform to be able to be united in our conversation on fighting for our rights. It gives us that global conversation to look at decolonizing systems that have been institutional racist over the years. It gives us a platform to be able to challenge the inequalities that have taken our voice and influence. And police brutality is police brutality wherever it is. Being Nigerian and being proud of my heritage, it brought no joy to see what NSAR's campaign protesters were treated like. We need to understand that they're fighting the same Black Lives Matter fight, but they're just fighting it in the continent. And this is why we look at the United States and the Black Lives Matter movement as a whole, because we need to be able to stand in solidarity with each other. If one Black person is going through the struggle, we all feel it. It's all our struggle together, and we're united in that. And I think that's why I feel that is beautiful.
The End SARS protests in Nigeria that Marvina mentioned there, that's the protest movement against police brutality that is going on in Nigeria. For you, how important is it that Black Lives Matter has become global?
We know that issues around police brutality aren't solely happening in the United States. And so for us to have created a platform that continues to add value to the struggles that our siblings are faced with in different parts of the world is important, and especially because that means we get to connect with one another, we get to support each other, we get to learn from one another in our different struggles. And it's important that, especially in the time of this global pandemic, that we don't feel isolated in our challenges or feel isolated that we're the only ones who care about this. What the global uprisings that we saw around the globe showed us is that people of conscience are quite literally everywhere. And the Nigerian people and people around the world have essentially said, enough is enough. We don't want to live in a world where some people are treated as though they're disposable.
Opal, can I ask a question that maybe I should have asked in the beginning? And it kind of relates to your own background working with immigration groups. And it's this: when you talk about Black Lives Matter, is it actually as broad as to say non-white? And I'm thinking particularly in the American context of immigration and Hispanic issues. Do you think that the Black Lives Matter movement has managed to become an umbrella movement for all racial equality for non-white people in the country?
Black Lives Matter is a unique intervention in our society that foregrounds the experiences of Black people. And it was important that we have this very specific expression, specific words, because for far too long, it was not seen as important to discuss race and racism in the United States. We were told that it did not matter, that our society was colorblind. We were told that we have a Black president, so we should shut up and be happy. And the reality was that Black people still continue to suffer high unemployment, mass incarceration, the number of challenges we've discussed. So it's important that we continue to maintain the focus and specificity on Black life and anti-Blackness around the globe. But the truth is that race and racism exists on a spectrum. And the closer you are to Blackness, or the darker your complexion, the more disdain you receive in the global community. And the closer you are to whiteness, the proximity to whiteness, the better you're received, the more superior you're treated, and so on. And so what we've said with Black Lives Matter is that as Black people get free, as we begin to see the victories in our movements, there are implications for all people of color, for all marginalized communities. We're not throwing anybody under the bus. We're not leaving anyone out. And in fact, because of the Black Lives Matter movement, we've seen many tremendous gains for other communities of color as well. Indigenous communities, for example, with the dropping of sports teams' names, that has been very powerful. So these are compatible or complementary movements, but there's something very specific about the need for Black Lives Matter to continue to win, and it makes room for so many other victories.
Opal Tometi, thank you so very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. This was great.
Carlos, I thought that was very interesting, and particularly the point that Opal made actually there just at the end on this is specifically called the Black Lives Matter movement. But the point being that, racism is on a spectrum, and the closer to white you are, the more privilege you have. And if you can address the concerns of Black people and make life more equal and just for Black people, then by default, you will also make life better for other people who are not white.
Yeah, indeed. I think there is a ripple effect. Katty, I think you've heard me say before that I feel like the tumult we've seen in the last year or two is not coming to an end, but it's just beginning, and that maybe this will end up being analogous to the civil rights movements of the early 60s in that they clearly had ripple effects and spillover effects on the women's movement, on the anti-war movement, on the environmental movement of that time. And so they were all interrelated ultimately at some level. And I wouldn't be surprised if BLM has a wider impact than just the question of Black Americans or Black people around the globe.
Yes, that it is putting a focus. I mean, I think very few people outside of America might associate climate change issues, for example, with racial injustice, but you only need to dig into America's building history and zoning history and the way that the cities were formed to see that African Americans who lived in bits of those cities, those are the cities where literally today the temperature is hotter because there were fewer parks, there were fewer sidewalks, there were fewer trees, things that white people had lobbied for back in the 1950s and 60s. And you're right, that movement is not just putting the spotlight on the more obvious high-profile issue of police brutality. It is in its wake affecting a whole load of other issues as well.
Indeed, indeed. One last thought is that, part of what you saw in the 60s was a proliferation of organizations focused on the justice movements of the time. So you had organizations like the SCLC, which Martin Luther King Jr. was involved in. You had SNCC, you had the Black Panthers, you had others. And so while BLM has become the most notable and most well-known, part of what could be intriguing over the next year or two, Katty, is as we see other groups develop and become part of the larger social conversation.
Very interesting. That is all we have time for. We hope that you have enjoyed this episode of When Katty Met Carlos, a co-production from the BBC World Service
and OZY Media. And if you've enjoyed this podcast, please write a review, tell a good friend, and don't forget to subscribe. Thank you, and we'll talk to you again soon.